So now let me go ahead and think a little bit about applications of purchasing power parity. So remember again, purchasing power parity claims that the real exchange rate is going to tend towards 1, which is equivalent to saying that we think the nominal exchange rate is going to be roughly equivalent to the foreign price level over the U.S. price level. So what happens if there is inflation in the U.S.? There is inflation in the U.S. Well, if there's inflation in the U.S., then the U.S. price level rises, and if there's inflation in the U.S. but no inflation in the foreign country, then the dollar loses value. And notice we now have two ways of thinking about the value of the dollar. There's the internal value of the dollar, which we talked about in terms of the money supply, money demand function. And the internal value of the dollar is 1 over the price level in the U.S. And there's also the external value of the dollar as measured by the exchange rate. And the external value of the dollar actually depends upon the value of the dollar relative to the foreign currency. So it's entirely possible for the dollar to be experiencing inflation in a U.S. context, and if nothing else changes in the rest of the world, it also loses value in an international context. But it could also be possible that while the U.S. is having inflation, the foreign inflation is even bigger, so that overall the exchange rate is going up. So the external value of the dollar depends on relative price levels. So we could see something happen where essentially these two things could move in opposite direction, again, like I just talked about. The other thing to think about here then is we know there tends to be, at least in the long run, a relationship between price level, money supply, and GDP. And in particular, remember, we have the price level from the quantity equation equals the money supply times the velocity of money over real GDP. So that's what happens in the U.S., and it depends on what happens with the U.S. money supply, U.S. velocity, and U.S. real GDP. We could also have something true of the rest of the world. That the price level in the rest of the world, and we're going to kind of think about the rest of the world as one big giant lump, depends upon what happens with those variables in the rest of the world. And we could sort of make this sort of really complicated here. That would probably be something like an extra credit question. But we can go ahead and come up with some forecasts of what's going to happen with relative prices if we know something about relative growth of money supply and real GDP. Second part of this video segment, I'm going to talk about sort of problems and exceptions. With purchasing power parity theory. So purchasing power parity theory, one, remember, it's a long-run theory. And in particular, if these kind of arbitrage things are going to take place, we might have years pass before arbitrage can completely affect the exchange rate. So I think I'd sort of say long-run theory, we're sort of talking maybe more than 2 to 3 years. There's sort of a gravitational pull to get the exchange rate back to 1, the real exchange rate back to 1, but it might take some time for this to take effect. The second thing is many goods, and especially services, are what we call non-traded. They aren't traded across international borders, often because the transport costs are essentially too high, or it's almost just impossible to transport things like haircuts or that kind of stuff. And when things are non-traded, they're not subject to arbitrage. And so services are one thing. Also, things like real estate are not tradable. So, not all goods in the price index can be arbitraged. So we don't think that the real exchange rate is going to go all the way to 1. Transport costs we saw were another one of them. Even if we had all goods transportable, because there is some transport costs, we would have some residual gap. What's going to happen here is that many of these non-tradable goods and services are going to be cheaper in poorer countries than in richer countries. So rents on real estate or wages or that sort of stuff on service labor. So in particular, relative to, say, the US, a very poor country is typically going to have a low real exchange rate relative to the US, and a country richer than the US would tend to have a relatively high real exchange rate relative to the US. So even if we were not looking at non-transportable goods, of course, transportable goods like gasoline or sweat socks or whatever still have a high amount of non-transportable services built into them, because retailing, for instance, is pretty much non-transportable across international borders. So again, this is sort of a gravitational pull to something back in the neighborhood of 1. Exactly how close to 1 we get is going to kind of depend. We're not going to expect it to get anywhere near 1 if we're talking about a very poor country relative to the US, but a country at a similar level of economic development, we would expect to get pretty close to 1 relative to the US.